Van Kampin paper on the basic science and fundamentals of regeneten was done a number of years ago, but what exactly did it look at and what did it talk about? The first thing it mentions and discusses is the problem that is associated to tendon tears. Tendon tears often get worse. Partial tears often go into full thickness tears, and full thickness tears that are repaired can often re-tear. This is because of the stress that's going through the particular part of the tendon. He then begins to talk about a particular solution, which is called bioinductive implant. And how this would work is by reducing the stresses and strains, by creating new tendon tissue. It would create a favorable healing environment for the tendon to heal itself. This would be called a biological augment and would be very different to the current grafts that are on the market that give strength at time zero. He then begins and starts talking about load sharing and states that tendons are transferring force from muscle to bone. But when too much force is removed, it actually causes a lot of weakness in the tendon. He then starts talking about Wolff's Law and at how tendons adapt to the stresses that they're put under. He talks about how too much stress will actually make the tendon tear a lot more, and too little stress will start causing atrophy within the tendon. And this then leads him into talking about stresses on tendons, especially partial thickness tears. When partial thickness tears occur, there's a lot more stress going through a smaller number of fibers. And over time, with all of that stress, that will actually increase the tear size and it will progressively get worse. This then has Van Kampin talking about the finite element analysis. Basically, he created a computer model that looked at how partial thickness tears function when there's a small piece of the tendon taken away from the overall tendon thickness. You could see where all the stresses started accumulating in the smaller part of the tendon when force is put through it. But what he then decided to do is increase the tendon thickness with functioning tendon by 2 millimeters and see what would happen and how it would decrease the peak stresses and strains. The results from this analysis showed that by placing the implant on the bursal side and increasing the tendon thickness with new tendon tissue, it decreased the peak stresses and strains of the bursal side of the tendon by 47%. But what he also found out was that on the articular side, the stresses and strains decreased by 40%. So basically it was able to show that if you put the implant on the bursal side, it will completely decrease the stresses and strains across the entire depth of the tendon. He then starts talking about how it actually works, and he states that there's no secret sauce or growth factors that actually differentiate this implant. But what it actually does is use the body's own healing ability in order to generate and create new tissue. And what it does is it actually uses fibroblasts that normally create connective tissue within the body to allow it to grow into the implant and remodel that collagen into new tendon tissue. He then starts speaking about what the implant is actually made from, that it's made from bovine Achilles tendon, which is the original source, but it's bioengineered and has all the cells taken out to be left with purified type 1 collagen. The reason why they remove all of the cells is so it doesn't have an immune response when it's put into the patient, which is also why it's considered an implant and not a biologic. Van Kampin then starts speaking about how the implant actually works when it's placed into the human body. Because of its extremely weak and porous structure, this allows blood vessels from the tendon to grow in through the implant and allows fibroblasts to migrate into it. He states that because the implant is so porous and open structure, this is what differentiates it and allows things to grow into it. Unlike other things that have structure to it, it doesn't allow things to grow into it, only around it. He then starts speaking about the modulus of the implant, how it has a very low modulus and it can mimic and stretch the same way the tendon does that it's just been attached to. Van Kampin then states that this is an extremely important part of the implant because this allows the implant to be broken down, being created into tendon tissue that is very similar or the same as the healthy tendon tissue underneath it, which isn't scar tissue.